The massive crystalline structure that housed the Galactic Overlord Council stretched across 3 moons in the Andromeda sector, its bioluminescent walls pulsing with the collective heartbeat of 1,000 conquered species. Within its central chamber, Supreme Overlord reviewed the latest intelligence reports with growing satisfaction. His 6 eyes, each the size of a human head, scanned holographic displays that showed resource extraction rates, population compliance statistics, and military deployment coordinates across the galaxy's outer rim. For 800 cycles, the Overlords had maintained perfect control over their expanding empire. They had crushed rebellions before they could gain momentum, harvested entire planetary populations for their labor value, and eliminated species that showed too much independence. The formula was simple and effective. Identify threats early, apply overwhelming force, and ensure no conquered race ever developed the technological capability to challenge Overlord supremacy. Attention focused on a particular sector designation, Sol 3, inhabited by a species called humans. The reports indicated these creatures had been successfully 12 cycles ago after a brief but decisive military campaign. Human resistance had collapsed within their own solar system when Overlord dreadnoughts destroyed their primary defensive installations and orbital platforms. The species had shown typical patterns of submission afterward, accepting Overlord governance in exchange for basic survival necessities. What made humans particularly valuable was their adaptability and work capacity. Unlike many conquered species that required extensive genetic modification to function in diverse environments, humans could operate effectively across a wide range of planetary conditions with minimal technological assistance. They had been redistributed across 17 different star systems, primarily for mining operations and agricultural development in hostile environments where other species would require expensive life support systems. The intelligence reports showed humans maintaining acceptable productivity levels across all assignment locations. There had been no significant incidents of rebellion, sabotage, or coordinated resistance activities. A few isolated cases of individual defiance had been dealt with through standard disciplinary measures, and the human population had responded appropriately by increasing their compliance and work output. Dismissed the human data files and moved on to more pressing concerns. The Overlords were preparing for their next major expansion phase, targeting several independent systems in the Vega cluster. These operations required careful coordination of military assets, resource allocation, and post-conquest integration protocols. Humans, along with several other successful species, would play crucial roles in developing the infrastructure necessary to support Overlord administration in the new territories. 3 cycles later, the first anomalies began appearing in the human sector reports. Minor discrepancies in population, counts that administrative staff attributed to clerical errors. Slight variations in production schedules that facility managers explained as normal fluctuations in worker efficiency. Equipment malfunctions that maintenance teams classified as routine mechanical failures requiring standard repair procedures. Nobody in the Overlord administrative hierarchy recognized these scattered incidents as components of a larger pattern. The Empire's bureaucratic structure was designed for efficiency in managing stable, compliant populations, not for detecting subtle signs of coordinated activity among supposedly species. Each department focused on their specific responsibilities without cross-referencing data that might have revealed the emerging picture. On the mining world of 442b, human work crews began experiencing what appeared to be random accidents that temporarily shut down extraction operations. Drilling equipment suffered unexpected failures that required several days to repair. Transport vehicles broke down in remote locations, forcing temporary suspension of ore shipments. Power generation systems experienced intermittent malfunctions that reduced facility operations to minimum levels. Overlord supervisors noted these incidents in their regular reports, but saw no cause for immediate concern. The human workers appeared appropriately frustrated by the delays and worked diligently to restore normal operations. Their behavior showed no signs of deliberate sabotage or organized resistance. Production targets were still being met over monthly and quarterly periods, despite the temporary setbacks. Similar patterns emerged across human work assignments throughout the sector. Agricultural facilities experienced crop diseases that required entire fields to be replanted with different varieties. Manufacturing plants dealt with quality control issues that necessitated retooling production lines. Transportation networks faced scheduling conflicts that created temporary bottlenecks in cargo movement between systems. The cumulative effect remained within acceptable parameters for system-wide operations, but the frequency of these minor disruptions began increasing gradually. What had started as isolated incidents occurring every few weeks evolved into daily occurrences of small-scale problems that required constant attention from overlord administrative staff and technical specialists. Regional Administrator, responsible for overseeing human work assignments in the sector, finally requested additional resources to address what he classified as infrastructure degradation issues. His formal requisition cited the need for expanded maintenance teams, upgraded equipment replacement schedules, and enhanced quality control procedures to maintain optimal productivity levels among human work populations. The request moved through standard bureaucratic channels, receiving approval stamps from various department heads who saw it as routine operational maintenance. Nobody questioned why infrastructure problems were occurring more frequently in sectors with human workers compared to facilities staffed by other conquered species. The Overlord administrative system was designed to address problems after they were clearly identified, not to analyze subtle patterns that might indicate emerging threats. Meanwhile, in the outer regions of human work assignments, something far more significant was taking place. In facilities where overlord supervision was lighter due to resource constraints and the assumed reliability of human workers, entire work crews were disappearing during shift changes. Security monitoring systems showed workers entering maintenance tunnels, storage areas, or remote sections of facilities, but never showed them leaving. Initial investigations attributed these disappearances to industrial accidents in dangerous work environments. Mining operations often involved unstable geological conditions where cave-ins or equipment failures could eliminate entire teams without leaving recoverable remains. The human population's reaction to these losses appeared consistent with normal grief and concern for safety, leading overlord administrators to implement additional safety protocols and memorial services to maintain worker morale. What the investigations failed to discover was that the missing humans weren't dead. They had been systematically extracted through carefully planned operations that exploited gaps in overlord security coverage and monitoring systems. The remaining human workers had developed sophisticated techniques for creating false sensor readings, manipulating surveillance equipment, and coordinating timing to ensure their colleagues could disappear without triggering automated security alerts. These extraction operations were part of a much larger strategy that had been developing since the initial human pacification 12 cycles earlier. Rather than organizing immediate resistance that would have been quickly crushed by superior overlord military forces, human survivors had chosen to implement a long-term plan based on patience, deception, and gradual resource accumulation. The disappearing humans weren't fleeing randomly into space. They were being collected by carefully positioned extraction teams operating from hidden bases established in asteroid fields, abandoned mining sites, and uncharted systems throughout the region. These bases had been constructed over several cycles using resources quietly diverted from official work assignments, equipment that had been reported as damaged or destroyed, and raw materials obtained through the systematic minor disruptions that overlord administrators were attributing to routine operational problems. Dr., former head of Human Space Defense Research, coordinated these operations from a hollowed-out asteroid in the Beta system. Her facility housed nearly 50,000 extracted humans who had been working to develop technologies and strategies for something the overlords couldn't imagine any conquered species attempting. A coordinated uprising designed to challenge their control across multiple star systems simultaneously. The human approach differed fundamentally from previous resistance movements that the overlords had encountered and crushed. Instead of relying on conventional military tactics or attempting to match overlord technological superiority directly, the humans were implementing what they called distributed asymmetric warfare. Their strategy involved simultaneously disrupting overlord operations across hundreds of locations, while avoiding concentrated engagements that would allow the enemy to bring their superior firepower to bear effectively. Reviewed the latest intelligence reports from human agents still working within overlord facilities. The extraction phase was nearly complete. Over the past 3 cycles, They had successfully removed nearly 2 million humans from Overlord work assignments while maintaining the appearance of normal population levels through careful manipulation of administrative records and creative accounting of industrial accidents and natural mortality rates. More importantly, they had identified critical vulnerabilities in Overlord infrastructure that could be exploited to create system-wide disruptions. The Empire's size and complexity had become a weakness that humans could use against them. Overlord command and control systems depended on predictable resource flows, stable communication networks, and reliable transportation corridors between star systems. Humans had spent years mapping these dependencies and developing ways to target them simultaneously. The next phase of operations would begin soon. Instead of continuing the gradual extraction and minor sabotage activities, humans would implement coordinated strikes designed to create cascading failures throughout Overlord administrative and military systems. The goal wasn't to win immediate military victories, but to force the Overlords into defensive positions where their technological advantages would be less effective, while creating opportunities for other conquered species to recognize that resistance was possible. Knew the odds remained heavily against human success. The Overlords commanded vastly superior military forces, controlled advanced technologies that humans could barely understand, and had 8 centuries of experience in crushing rebellions. But humans had advantages that previous resistance movements had lacked. Time to prepare thoroughly detailed knowledge of Overlord systems gained through years of forced labor, and most critically, the ability to operate as a distributed network rather than a centralized organization that could be targeted and destroyed. As she prepared to authorize the beginning of active resistance operations, remembered the words spoken by General Harrison Torres during the final days of human independence. "We're not trying to win a war today. We're trying to ensure that someday someone will be able to win a war. If that someone has to be our children, then we'll give them the tools they need." The tools were finally ready. Across 17 star systems, human agents prepared to demonstrate that the Galactic Overlord's perfect control was nothing more than an illusion built on the assumption that conquered species would remain permanently defeated. In the next few cycles, the galaxy would discover whether 800 years of Overlord supremacy could withstand the determination of a species that refused to accept permanent submission. The countdown to Operation Exodus had begun. The coordinated strikes began at precisely 3:47 Standard Galactic Time across 17 star systems. In the sector, human maintenance teams simultaneously triggered overloads in the primary power distribution networks serving 3 major mining complexes. The facilities didn't explode dramatically or create obvious signs of sabotage. Instead, they experienced cascading system failures that appeared to result from random equipment malfunctions occurring at the worst possible moments. Mining supervisor received the first emergency reports while reviewing production schedules for the upcoming cycle. His communication console lit up with incoming alerts from facility managers across his assigned territories. Power grid failures, transportation breakdowns, communication system disruptions, and equipment malfunctions were being reported from dozens of locations within a 6-hour window. Initially, assumed the reports indicated an unusual coincidence of mechanical problems that would require standard repair procedures. He dispatched maintenance teams to address the most critical issues while filing routine malfunction reports with the regional administration. The problems seemed frustrating but manageable through normal operational responses. What didn't realize was that every maintenance team he sent to repair the reported problems included human workers who had been waiting years for this moment. As Overlord technical specialists focused on diagnosing the apparent equipment failures, human team members quietly disabled backup systems, corrupted diagnostic databases, and introduced subtle modifications to repair procedures that would ensure the problems would recur with increasing frequency. In the agricultural sectors of the system, similar coordination was creating what appeared to be a massive crop blight affecting multiple planetary environments simultaneously. Human agricultural specialists had spent 3 cycles carefully introducing dormant genetic modifications into seed stocks, soil treatment chemicals, and irrigation systems. When activated by specific environmental triggers, these modifications created crop failures that looked like natural disasters, but were actually precisely controlled biological warfare. The genius of the human approach lay in its apparent randomness and technical plausibility. Every incident could be explained by existing knowledge of equipment reliability, environmental factors, or normal operational hazards. Overlord administrators and technical specialists found themselves dealing with problems that fit within their experience and training, even as the frequency and scope of these problems stretched their resources beyond normal capacity. Dr. Sarah coordinated the biological warfare aspects of Operation Exodus from a hidden research facility built inside a seemingly abandoned asteroid mining operation. Her team had developed what they called delayed action agricultural warfare, based on their understanding of Overlord food production systems and distribution networks. The Overlords maintained their empire's food security through highly centralized agricultural operations that maximized efficiency and minimized transportation costs. Massive planetary farming operations produced standardized crop varieties that were processed in orbital facilities and distributed throughout the empire according to carefully calculated nutritional requirements for different species. This centralization created a vulnerability that humans could exploit. By introducing genetic modifications that would cause crop failures after specific time delays, they could create food shortages that would force the overlords to divert transportation resources, redeploy agricultural specialists, and implement emergency food distribution protocols that would strain their administrative systems. The modifications were designed to create multiple waves of problems over several cycles. Initial crop failures would require replanting with different varieties, but those replacement crops would also fail due to secondary modifications triggered by different environmental conditions. The overlords would find themselves dealing with agricultural crises that seemed to spread randomly across different systems, making it difficult to identify patterns or implement effective countermeasures. Meanwhile, in the manufacturing sectors of the Vega cluster, human industrial specialists were implementing what they called cascade manufacturing disruption. Instead of sabotaging individual facilities in obvious ways, they were introducing subtle flaws into quality control systems that would create defective products requiring recalls and production line modifications. The strategy relied on the overlords' own commitment to efficiency and standardization. Their manufacturing systems produced identical products across multiple facilities using shared specifications, quality control protocols, and distribution networks. By corrupting the technical databases that controlled these systems, humans could ensure that defects introduced in one facility would be replicated across the entire production network. Commander Rachel supervised these operations from a concealed command center built inside what appeared to be a routine cargo transfer station in the outer asteroid belt. Her team had identified critical points in overlord manufacturing and logistics networks where small disruptions could create system-wide effects. The overlords manufactured everything from basic tools and equipment to advanced military systems using integrated production networks that maximized resource efficiency and maintained quality consistency. Raw materials were processed in automated facilities, assembled into components at specialized plants, and combined into finished products at final assembly locations before distribution to end users throughout the empire. This integration meant that disruptions at any point in the process could affect multiple downstream operations. If humans corrupted the specifications for basic components, every product using those components would require modification or replacement. If they interfered with quality control systems, entire product lines might need to be recalled and remanufactured using different procedures. The beauty of the human strategy was that it used the overlord's own systems against them. Every efficiency the empire had built into its operations became a pathway for cascading problems that would strain resources and create opportunities for further disruption. As reports of these problems began flowing through overlord administrative channels, patterns started emerging that should have triggered security investigations. But the empire's bureaucratic structure was designed to handle problems sequentially rather than analyze them systematically. Each department focused on resolving issues within their specific area of responsibility without coordinating with other departments that might be experiencing related difficulties. Regional Administrator found his workload increasing exponentially as reports of equipment failures, agricultural problems, and manufacturing defects accumulated on his desk. He authorized additional resources for repair operations, approved emergency procurement of replacement equipment, and implemented temporary workarounds to maintain critical operations while permanent solutions were developed. What he didn't recognize was that the human teams assigned to implement these solutions were actually expanding the scope of the problems while appearing to work diligently on repairs. Every repair operation created opportunities to introduce new vulnerabilities. Every replacement component included subtle modifications that would cause future failures, and every temporary workaround was designed to become a permanent weakness in Overlord systems. The Overlords' confidence in their technological superiority and administrative efficiency had become a critical vulnerability that humans exploited ruthlessly. Because the Empire had never faced sophisticated resistance from a conquered species, their security protocols focused on preventing obvious threats rather than detecting subtle manipulation of their own systems. 3 weeks into Operation Exodus, the cumulative effects began creating visible strain on Overlord operations across the affected sectors. Production schedules were falling behind target dates, transportation networks were experiencing chronic delays, and administrative personnel were working extended shifts to manage the increasing volume of problem reports and repair requests. Supreme Overlord finally received briefings indicating that the scope of operational difficulties suggested more than routine mechanical problems or environmental factors. His intelligence analysts had identified statistical anomalies in the distribution and timing of reported incidents that indicated possible coordination among seemingly unrelated events. The briefings noted that sectors with significant human worker populations were experiencing higher rates of operational difficulties compared to facilities staffed primarily by other conquered species. While this correlation didn't prove human involvement in the problems, it suggested that additional investigation might be warranted to ensure system security. Authorized enhanced security monitoring for human work populations and expanded surveillance of facilities where humans had access to critical systems. He also ordered intelligence teams to investigate whether the operational problems might be connected to organized resistance activities. These security measures came too late to prevent the next phase of human operations. Doctor had anticipated that the Overlords would eventually recognize patterns in the disruptions and respond with increased security measures. The human strategy had been designed to accomplish specific objectives during the window of time before such measures could be implemented effectively. The extracted human population had used their time in hidden bases to develop advanced technologies based on detailed analysis of captured Overlord equipment and systems. They had reverse-engineered critical components, identified vulnerabilities in Overlord military hardware, and created weapons specifically designed to exploit weaknesses in enemy defensive systems. More importantly, they had established communication networks that allowed coordination between hidden human populations and resistance cells throughout the galaxy. Using modified Overlord communication equipment and carefully planned relay systems, they could transmit information and instructions across vast distances without detection by Empire security systems. The next phase of operations would move beyond subtle sabotage and infrastructure disruption to direct military action against Overlord installations. Human forces had spent years preparing for coordinated strikes that would demonstrate their capability to challenge Overlord military supremacy while avoiding concentrated engagements that would allow the enemy to use their numerical and technological advantages effectively. As reviewed intelligence reports and authorized additional security measures, he remained confident that any organized resistance could be crushed through the application of overwhelming force. The Overlords had dealt with hundreds of similar challenges over 8 centuries of empire building. They had the experience, resources, and military capabilities necessary to eliminate any threat to their continued dominance. What he didn't understand was that humans weren't following the patterns of previous resistance movements. They weren't trying to achieve immediate military victory or attempting to match Overlord capabilities directly. Instead, they were implementing a strategy designed to create conditions that would make Overlord control increasingly difficult to maintain across the vast scope of their empire. The real test was about to begin. The first direct military strikes occurred simultaneously across 12 star systems as human strike teams emerged from their hidden positions to attack critical Overlord infrastructure installations. Unlike conventional military assaults designed to capture and hold territory, these operations were planned as precision raids that would inflict maximum damage before withdrawing to avoid retaliation. Captain led the assault on the primary communication relay station in the sector. His team of 43 human commandos had spent 6 months infiltrating the facility's outer defensive perimeter using stolen Overlord identification codes and forged work assignments. They knew the station's security protocols, shift schedules, and technical specifications better than most of the Overlord personnel who operated it. The communication relay station served as a critical node in the Empire's command and control network, processing and redirecting signals between regional administrative centers and military commands throughout the outer territories. Its destruction would create communication blackouts affecting dozens of star systems and force the Overlords to reroute their command traffic through backup systems that were slower and less secure. The team struck during a scheduled maintenance period when the station's defensive systems were operating at reduced capacity. They disabled security sensors using techniques developed through years of studying Overlord technology, neutralized automated defensive weapons with precisely targeted electromagnetic pulse devices, and penetrated the facility's central core within 18 minutes of initiating their attack. The Overlord security forces responded according to their standard protocols for dealing with facility intrusions. They sealed the installation to prevent escape, activated internal security measures to locate and contain the intruders, and requested backup from nearby military units to provide additional firepower and tactical support. But the human assault followed a completely different tactical doctrine that exploited weaknesses in Overlord defensive thinking. Instead of attempting to capture and hold the facility, the team implemented what they called surgical demolition, designed to create maximum system damage with minimum exposure to counterattack. They had spent months analyzing the station's technical architecture to identify critical components whose destruction would create cascading failures throughout the communication network. Rather than attempting to destroy the entire facility, they targeted specific systems whose loss would render the installation inoperable while requiring extensive reconstruction rather than simple repairs. The primary data processing cores, backup power generation systems, and quantum communication transceivers were destroyed using precisely placed explosive charges that had been manufactured from materials diverted from routine mining operations. The charges were designed to create localized destruction that would prevent rapid repairs while avoiding the massive explosions that might endanger surrounding systems or civilian populations. Within 47 minutes of initiating their assault, the team had completed their objectives and withdrawn from the facility using escape routes that had been prepared months earlier. They disappeared into the asteroid fields surrounding the star system, while Overlord security forces were still attempting to assess the extent of damage and organize pursuit operations. Similar raids were occurring throughout the affected sectors as human strike teams targeted transportation hubs, manufacturing centers, administrative facilities, and military supply depots. Each operation was planned and executed as an independent mission that would accomplish specific objectives regardless of what happened at other target locations. The human strategy relied on overwhelming the Overlord response capabilities through simultaneous actions across multiple star systems. By striking dozens of targets within a compressed time frame, they ensured that enemy forces would be spread too thin to provide effective protection for all critical installations, while creating confusion about the scope and coordination of the resistance activities. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Torres coordinated these operations from the primary human command center hidden in the asteroid belt. Her team monitored the progress of individual missions while managing the complex logistics necessary to support simultaneous military operations across such vast distances. The challenge of coordinating resistance activities on this scale had required developing communication and supply systems that could function independently of Overlord infrastructure, while remaining undetectable by Empire security forces. Humans had created a shadow network that paralleled the official systems, but operated according to completely different principles. Instead of relying on centralized control structures that could be disrupted by targeting key facilities, the human network functioned as a distributed system where individual cells could operate independently while sharing information and resources through carefully managed connections. Each resistance group maintained operational security while contributing to larger strategic objectives. This approach meant that the destruction of any single human facility or the capture of resistance personnel wouldn't compromise other operations or reveal the locations of additional human bases. The overlords were discovering that their traditional tactics for crushing rebellions were ineffective against an enemy that didn't conform to standard organizational patterns. Within 72 hours of the initial strikes, reports reached Supreme Overlord indicating that the scope and sophistication of the attacks suggested a level of organization and technological capability that shouldn't exist among conquered human populations. Intelligence analysts estimated that the coordination required for simultaneous operations across 12 star systems indicated the involvement of at least 50,000 trained personnel operating from hidden bases with advanced equipment and communication systems. The implications were staggering. The overlords had assumed that human military capabilities had been completely eliminated during the pacification campaign 12 cycles earlier. The existence of large, organized human forces suggested that either the initial conquest had been less successful than reported, or humans had somehow rebuilt their military infrastructure under overlord occupation without detection. Authorized immediate military responses to crush the human resistance before it could expand further. Battle fleets were dispatched to sectors where attacks had occurred. Security forces were deployed to facilities throughout human-occupied territories, and intelligence operations were initiated to locate and destroy hidden human bases. The military response followed standard overlord doctrine for dealing with resistance movements. Overwhelming force would be applied to eliminate organized opposition. Harsh punishment would be implemented to discourage further rebellion, and surviving populations would be relocated to more secure facilities where resistance activities would be impossible. But as overlord forces moved to implement these measures, they discovered that the human resistance had anticipated their responses and prepared countermeasures that exploited weaknesses in traditional military thinking. The humans weren't fighting a conventional war, where armies met in open battle and victory went to the side with superior firepower and technology. Admiral L commanded the battle fleet assigned to eliminate human forces in the sector. His ships represented the most advanced military technology in the galaxy, with defensive systems that could withstand direct hits from planet-killing weapons and offensive capabilities that could sterilize entire worlds within hours. When his fleet arrived at the locations where human attacks had occurred, they found no enemy forces to engage. The communication relay station had been destroyed, but the attackers had vanished without leaving traces that could be followed. Deep space scanning detected no signs of hidden bases, enemy ships, or organized military installations in the surrounding systems. Standard military doctrine called for expanding the search pattern to locate enemy forces and engaging them with overwhelming firepower to achieve decisive victory. But the humans had designed their operations to avoid exactly this type of conventional military response. Instead of concentrating their forces in locations where they could be detected and destroyed, human resistance cells had dispersed throughout the vast empty spaces between star systems. They operated from mobile bases hidden in asteroid fields, abandoned mining operations, and uncharted regions where overlord patrols rarely ventured. When overlord search operations approached areas where human forces might be located, the resistance cells simply moved to different hiding places or temporarily shut down their operations to avoid detection. They could remain undetected indefinitely while continuing to plan and prepare for future strikes against overlord targets. The human strategy was forcing the overlords into a defensive posture that was completely contrary to their military doctrine and administrative efficiency. Instead of maintaining control through minimal garrison forces backed by the threat of massive retaliation, they were being forced to deploy significant resources to protect installations throughout their empire against an enemy that could strike anywhere at any time. More troubling was the discovery that human attacks were having effects beyond their immediate physical damage. The destruction of communication facilities was creating information blackouts that interfered with administrative coordination between different sectors. Transportation disruptions were causing resource shortages that affected production schedules and civilian supply systems. Manufacturing problems were creating equipment shortages that hampered repair operations and military logistics. The cumulative impact was straining the Empire's administrative and logistical systems in ways that the overlords had never experienced. Their civilization had been built on the assumption that conquered species would remain permanently, and that resistance activities could be quickly crushed through the application of superior force. Regional Administrator found himself managing crisis situations across multiple sectors simultaneously, while lacking the resources necessary to address all the problems effectively. His requests for additional personnel, equipment, and military support were competing with similar requests from administrators throughout the Empire who were dealing with comparable difficulties in their assigned territories. The Central Overlord government was beginning to realize that the human resistance represented a fundamentally different type of challenge than previous rebellions. The humans weren't attempting to achieve immediate victory through conventional military conquest. Instead, they were implementing a strategy designed to make Overlord control increasingly expensive and difficult to maintain over time. Doctor monitored Overlord responses to human operations while planning the next phase of resistance activities. Intelligence reports from agents still working within Overlord facilities indicated that the Empire's leadership was struggling to develop effective countermeasures against human tactics. The success of the initial strikes had demonstrated that humans could inflict significant damage on Overlord infrastructure while avoiding decisive confrontation with superior enemy forces. But the real test would come as the Overlords adapted their security measures and military responses to address the specific threats that human resistance represented. The next phase of operations would determine whether human resistance could sustain its effectiveness, as the Overlords committed increasing resources to eliminating the threat to their control. The war for human freedom was entering a critical stage, where strategic innovation would matter more than raw military power. The galaxy was about to discover whether an empire built on 8 centuries of unchallenged dominance could adapt quickly enough to survive the determined resistance of a species that refused to accept permanent defeat. The psychological impact of sustained human resistance began manifesting throughout Overlord territories as conquered species observed that the supposedly invincible empire could be challenged and damaged by organized opposition. On mining worlds in the Vega cluster, work crews of laborers started experiencing what their supervisors classified as decreased productivity and increased disciplinary problems. Facility Manager X reviewed weekly reports showing subtle but consistent changes in worker behavior across multiple installations. Absenteeism rates were increasing, equipment maintenance issues were becoming more frequent, and productivity metrics were declining despite the implementation of additional incentive programs and disciplinary measures. The problems seemed to arise from general morale issues rather than organized resistance activities. Individual workers were making small mistakes, taking longer breaks, and showing less initiative in their assigned duties. There were no clear signs of sabotage or coordinated opposition, just a gradual deterioration in the efficiency and compliance that had characterized workers for decades. What X didn't understand was that news of human resistance activities was spreading through informal communication networks that connected conquered species across different star systems. Workers who had accepted Overlord rule as an unchangeable reality were beginning to question whether permanent submission was actually necessary for survival. They weren't planning immediate rebellion or attempting to replicate human tactics. Instead, they were testing the boundaries of Overlord control through small acts of non-cooperation that could be attributed to individual performance issues rather than organized resistance. They were learning that the Empire's response capabilities were already stretched thin by human operations and couldn't address every minor disruption effectively. Similar patterns were emerging among other conquered species throughout the galaxy. The in-manufacturing sectors began experiencing higher rates of quality control failures. Agricultural workers showed increased incidents of crop handling errors that reduced harvest yields. Transportation crews from multiple species reported more frequent navigation mistakes and scheduling conflicts. None of these activities constituted open rebellion or direct challenge to Overlord authority, but their cumulative effect was creating additional strain on Empire resources while demonstrating that the psychological foundations of overlord control were beginning to erode. Commander General or received intelligence briefings indicating that human resistance activities were having secondary effects beyond their direct military and infrastructure impacts. Morale and compliance issues were appearing among previously reliable conquered species, suggesting that human actions were inspiring broader opposition to overlord rule. The implications were potentially catastrophic for empire stability. The overlord system of control depended on the acceptance by conquered species that resistance was futile, and that cooperation with imperial authority was the only viable option for survival. If that psychological foundation collapsed, the empire would face simultaneous resistance movements from dozens of different species across hundreds of star systems. Or recommended implementing immediate measures to contain the spread of resistance thinking among conquered populations. Increased surveillance, stricter disciplinary policies, and enhanced security protocols would demonstrate continued overlord strength while preventing the formation of organized opposition movements. But these measures required resources and personnel that were already being diverted to address human resistance activities. Every ship assigned to patrol duties was unavailable for offensive operations. Every security team deployed to monitor conquered populations was taken away from facilities that needed protection against human attacks. Every administrator focused on maintaining control in one sector was unable to address problems developing in other regions. The humans had successfully forced the overlords into a strategic dilemma where every response to resistance activities created new vulnerabilities that could be exploited by future operations. The Empire's vast size and complexity, which had been sources of strength during periods of stable control, were becoming weaknesses that amplified the effects of disruption and made comprehensive security increasingly difficult to maintain. Doctor analyzed intelligence reports from human agents throughout Overlord territory while planning the next escalation of resistance operations. The success of their strategy was exceeding initial projections, but she knew that the Overlords would eventually develop more effective countermeasures unless human activities continued to evolve and expand. The key to sustaining resistance effectiveness was maintaining the initiative through continuous innovation and adaptation. As the Overlords committed resources to address specific types of human activities, resistance operations would shift to exploit new vulnerabilities created by those defensive measures. The next phase would involve what humans called Cascade Rebellion, designed to transform the spontaneous resistance activities appearing among other conquered species into coordinated opposition movements that would multiply the effectiveness of human operations. Instead of fighting the Overlords alone, humans would provide leadership and technical assistance to help other species develop their own resistance capabilities. This approach required establishing secure communication links with potential allies while providing them with tactical knowledge, organizational structures, and technological resources necessary to conduct effective resistance operations. The goal was creating a galaxy-wide insurgency that would overwhelm Overlord response capabilities while avoiding the concentrated opposition that could be defeated through massive retaliation. Captain Maria Santos led the first diplomatic mission to establish formal cooperation with resistance cells that had begun forming in response to human example. Her team traveled to the Altair system using a heavily modified cargo vessel that appeared to be conducting routine supply deliveries while actually carrying advanced communication equipment, weapons, and tactical specialists. The challenge of conducting diplomatic operations under Overlord occupation required techniques that humans had developed through years of underground activity. Meetings were arranged through coded messages embedded in routine work communications, conducted in locations that avoided security surveillance, and structured to provide maximum information exchange while minimizing exposure risks for all participants. The WHO agreed to meet with human representatives were industrial supervisors and technical specialists who had access to critical systems within their assigned facilities. They had been observing human resistance activities with growing interest while evaluating whether similar operations might be possible within their own communities. What they discovered was that humans had developed sophisticated methods for resistance organization that could be adapted to different species and environmental conditions. The basic principles of distributed operations, security protocols, and tactical coordination were transferable even when specific techniques required modification to accommodate different physiological capabilities and technological resources. Santos provided the representatives with communication equipment that would allow secure coordination with human operations while maintaining their independence and security. She also shared tactical manuals that had been developed through human experience in resistance operations, adapted to address the specific capabilities and limitations of physiology and technology. The goal wasn't creating subordinates who would follow human commands, but rather developing autonomous resistance movements that would coordinate with human operations while pursuing their own liberation objectives. Each species would contribute their unique capabilities to shared strategic goals while maintaining operational independence that would prevent the overlords from disrupting the entire resistance network by targeting any single component. Similar diplomatic missions were establishing cooperation agreements with resistance groups among the and several smaller conquered species throughout the galaxy. Each new alliance the scope and complexity of opposition activities while making it increasingly difficult for overlord forces to predict or counter resistance operations. Supreme Overlord convened an emergency session of the Galactic Council to address what intelligence analysts were classifying as a comprehensive threat to Empire stability. The human resistance had evolved from isolated terrorist activities into the foundation for a galaxy-wide insurgency that was attracting participation from multiple conquered species. The briefing materials presented to Council members detailed the scope of resistance activities across more than 30 star systems, involving an estimated 2 million active participants from at least 8 different species. Damage assessments indicated that critical infrastructure had been compromised, production capacity was declining, and administrative efficiency was deteriorating throughout the affected regions. More alarming was the intelligence indicating that resistance activities were expanding faster than Overlord security forces could contain them. New resistance cells were forming more quickly than existing ones could be eliminated, and the coordination between different species was making it increasingly difficult to predict or prevent future attacks. Council members debated various options for addressing the crisis, ranging from massive military campaigns designed to eliminate all resistance through overwhelming force to negotiated settlements that might address some conquered species' grievances while maintaining overall overlord control. But the discussions revealed fundamental disagreements about whether the Empire should adapt its methods of control or double down on traditional approaches that had been successful for 8 centuries. Some council members argued that negotiating with resistance movements would be interpreted as weakness that would encourage further rebellion. Others suggested that military solutions alone couldn't address the underlying causes of widespread resistance. The debate was complicated by resource constraints that limited the Empire's ability to implement comprehensive solutions. The military campaigns necessary to crush resistance movements throughout the galaxy would require redeploying forces from frontier regions where they were needed to maintain security and continue expansion operations. The administrative reforms necessary to address conquered species grievances would require personnel and resources that were already stretched thin by current security requirements. As council members struggled to develop effective responses to the growing crisis, human resistance operations were entering their next phase of escalation. Doctor had authorized the implementation of strategic infrastructure targeting, designed to create system failures that would demonstrate the vulnerability of overlord control while proving to conquered species that organized resistance could achieve meaningful results. The targets for these operations were carefully selected to maximize their psychological and strategic impact while avoiding casualties that might unite conquered species against human activities. Transportation networks, communication systems, and manufacturing facilities would be disrupted in ways that affected overlord administrative and military capabilities while minimizing harm to civilian populations. Major Jackson Riley coordinated the assault on the primary facility in the Sirius sector, a massive installation that controlled interstellar transportation between 12 star systems. The facility's destruction would isolate entire regions from rapid reinforcement or resupply, while forcing the overlords to rely on slower conventional transportation methods that could be more easily intercepted and disrupted. The operation required penetrating the most heavily defended installation in the sector, using techniques that had been refined through dozens of previous missions. Riley's team included specialists in every aspect of Overlord technology and security systems, supported by intelligence gathered through years of careful observation and analysis. As human forces moved into position for these strategic strikes, the galaxy stood on the brink of a transformation that would determine whether 8 centuries of Overlord dominance could survive the determined resistance of species that refused to accept permanent subjugation. The next phase of operations would test the limits of human strategy, while demonstrating whether organized resistance could create conditions for genuine liberation or merely temporary disruption of imperial control. The outcome would determine not just the fate of humanity, but the future of every conquered species throughout the galaxy. The assault on the Sirius facility began during the facility's scheduled maintenance cycle, when defensive systems were operating at reduced capacity to allow technician access to critical components. Major Jackson Riley's strike team had spent 4 months infiltrating the installation's workforce using forged credentials and carefully constructed cover identities that had passed multiple security screenings. The itself represented the pinnacle of Overlord transportation technology, a massive ring structure nearly 2 kilometers in diameter that could open stable wormholes connecting distant star systems. Its operation required precise coordination between quantum field generators, dimensional stabilizers, and navigational computers that maintained accuracy across galactic distances. Riley's team understood that destroying the completely would require more explosive power than they could deploy without causing massive casualties among civilian populations in the surrounding system. Instead, they planned to disable critical control systems that would render the facility inoperable while requiring extensive reconstruction rather than simple repairs. The key targets were the quantum field generators that created the stable energy patterns necessary for wormhole formation. These systems were protected by multiple layers of security and redundancy, but human analysis had identified vulnerabilities that could be exploited by precisely timed electromagnetic pulse attacks delivered from inside the facility's shielded control centers. As Riley's team moved into position, similar operations were beginning at facilities in 6 other star systems. The coordinated nature of these attacks would prevent the Overlords from isolating damaged regions by rerouting traffic through alternate gates while demonstrating the scope of human capabilities to resistance movements throughout the galaxy. The electromagnetic pulse devices had been constructed from components diverted from routine maintenance operations over several cycles, assembled using techniques developed through careful study of captured Overlord technology. They were designed to create localized field disruptions that would overload quantum generators without affecting surrounding systems or creating detectable energy signatures that might alert security monitoring systems. 18 minutes into the operation, Riley's team had successfully disabled the primary and secondary quantum field generators while corrupting the navigational databases that controlled gate targeting coordinates. The facility would require complete reconstruction of its core systems before it could resume operations, a process that would take months even with unlimited resources and priority allocation. As Overlord security forces responded to the emergency alerts triggered by system failures, they discovered that the damage was far more extensive than initial assessments had indicated. The attackers had targeted specific components whose destruction would create cascading failures throughout the facility's entire operational infrastructure. Admiral L received emergency reports indicating that 7 major facilities had been attacked simultaneously, with damage assessments suggesting that interstellar transportation capacity had been reduced by approximately 60% throughout the outer territories. The remaining functional gates were experiencing massive traffic overloads as administrators attempted to reroute essential supplies and personnel through the surviving transportation links. The strategic implications were devastating. The Overlord Empire's control depended on the ability to rapidly deploy military forces and administrative resources anywhere rebellion or resistance activities threatened imperial authority. With the network severely damaged, travel times between star systems would increase from days to months, making coordinated responses to resistance activities virtually impossible. More critically, the attacks had been timed to coincide with scheduled resource shipments that were essential for maintaining Overlord installations throughout the affected regions. Food supplies, manufactured goods, replacement equipment, and medical resources were stranded in transit while alternative transportation arrangements were developed. Supreme Overlord convened an emergency military council to address what was clearly a coordinated assault on the Empire's fundamental infrastructure. Intelligence reports indicated that the attacks demonstrated planning sophistication and technological capabilities that suggested human resistance had evolved far beyond the scattered terrorist activities that had characterized earlier phases of their opposition. The Council faced a strategic dilemma that threatened the foundation of Overlord control. Military doctrine called for massive retaliation against resistance activities to demonstrate Imperial strength and discourage further rebellion. But the damage to transportation infrastructure made it impossible to deploy sufficient forces to implement comprehensive military solutions within any reasonable general or presented options for military response that ranged from concentrated attacks on known human bases to systematic elimination of all conquered populations in affected regions. But each option required transportation and logistical capabilities that were no longer available due to the attacks. The irony was obvious to everyone present. The Overlords possessed military technology that could sterilize entire planets, but their ability to deploy that technology had been crippled by attacks on infrastructure systems that they had never considered vulnerable to resistance activities. As the military council debated response options, Doctor was preparing to implement the final phase of Operation Exodus. The success of the attacks had created exactly the conditions necessary for what humans called Liberation Cascade, designed to transform isolated resistance activities into coordinated independence movements that could establish permanent autonomous zones free from Overlord control. The key to successful liberation was establishing sustainable governance and economic systems that could function independently of Imperial infrastructure while providing conquered species with viable alternatives to Overlord administration. This required not just military success against Imperial forces, but the development of diplomatic, technical, and administrative capabilities that could support independent civilizations. Human resistance had spent years preparing for this transition by developing prototype governance systems, establishing resource-sharing agreements between different species, and creating technological solutions for problems that would arise when Imperial support systems were no longer available. Captain Sarah led diplomatic missions to resistance groups throughout the galaxy, offering technical assistance and organizational support for establishing independent governments in regions where Overlord control had been disrupted. The goal was creating a network of autonomous systems that could provide mutual support while maintaining their independence from Imperial authority. The challenge was enormous. Most conquered species had lived under Overlord rule for generations and had no experience with independent governance or economic management. They would need to develop administrative systems, establish trade relationships, and create military forces capable of defending their independence against eventual Overlord retaliation. But the psychological impact of successful resistance operations had transformed the political landscape throughout the galaxy. Species that had accepted Overlord rule as unchangeable reality were discovering that organized opposition could achieve meaningful results while providing practical alternatives to Imperial control. On the agricultural world of 442b, resistance leaders declared independence from Overlord authority and established the Free Republic of Altair based on democratic principles adapted from human political theory. Their declaration was followed within days by similar announcements from manufacturing colonies, mining settlements, and smaller communities representing a dozen different species. The declarations of independence weren't mere symbolic gestures. Each new autonomous government implemented practical measures to ensure their survival and prosperity without Overlord support. Trade agreements were established between different independent systems. Mutual defense pacts were signed to coordinate resistance against Imperial retaliation, and resource-sharing protocols were developed to address shortages and economic disruptions. Regional Administrator watched his administrative authority collapse as conquered species throughout his assigned territories rejected Overlord governance and established independent governments. His attempts to maintain Imperial control were hindered by communication disruptions, transportation delays, and the simple fact that most of his administrative staff were members of species that had declared independence. The situation, reports he transmitted to Central Command, painted a picture of comprehensive imperial collapse throughout the outer territories. Administrative systems were non-functional, resource extraction had ceased, and military installations were being abandoned by personnel who were joining independence movements or simply disappearing into the chaos of galactic transformation. Supreme Overlord realized that the Empire was facing an existential crisis that threatened 8 centuries of imperial expansion and development. The human resistance had successfully transformed isolated opposition activities into a galaxy-wide independence movement that was dismantling Overlord control faster than military forces could respond. The final Emergency Council session lasted 18 hours as Overlord leadership debated options for preserving imperial authority in the face of comprehensive rebellion. Intelligence reports indicated that over 40 star systems had declared independence, with more joining the liberation movement daily as news of successful resistance spread throughout conquered territories. Military advisors presented scenarios for reconquest that would require decades of systematic warfare against an enemy that controlled significant territory and resources while enjoying popular support from multiple species. The costs would be enormous, the outcomes uncertain, and the process would likely trigger additional independence movements in regions that had not yet joined the rebellion. Economic advisors calculated that the Empire's resource base had been reduced by approximately 70% due to the loss of conquered territories, while military expenditures would increase exponentially if reconquest campaigns were authorized. The mathematics suggested that continued warfare might bankrupt the imperial government before military objectives could be achieved. As debates continued within the Emergency Council, Doctor transmitted a message through diplomatic channels that had been established for communication between human resistance and imperial authorities. The message was simple and direct. The galaxy had changed forever, and the age of Overlord dominance was ending. The humans offered to negotiate peaceful coexistence between the independent systems and remaining Overlord territories, based on mutual respect for sovereignty, and the principle that no species had the right to rule others without their consent. The alternative was continued warfare that would eventually destroy both sides while accomplishing nothing except perpetuating suffering throughout the galaxy. The message concluded with a reminder that humans had never sought conquest or domination over other species. Their goal had always been simple: freedom for themselves and every other species that desired independence from imperial control. That goal had been achieved through determination, sacrifice, and the courage to resist oppression despite overwhelming odds. Supreme Overlord read the human message while reviewing intelligence reports that detailed the scope of imperial collapse. Nearly half the galaxy had declared independence from Overlord control, and military projections suggested that reconquest would take longer than the Empire's resources could sustain. The choice was clear: accept the new reality and negotiate peaceful coexistence with the independent systems, or commit the Empire to a war that would likely result in mutual destruction. After 800 cycles of unchallenged dominance, the Overlords had finally encountered a force they could not defeat through superior technology and overwhelming military power. The age of Galactic Empire was ending. The age of independent civilizations was beginning. And throughout the galaxy, species that had lived under conquest for generations were learning that freedom was not just possible, but achievable through courage, determination, and the refusal to accept permanent subjugation. The humans had kept their promise. They had given the galaxy the tools necessary to win its freedom. The rest of the story would be written by every species brave enough to claim their independence and defend it against any force that would take it away.